Hello, everyone. Here we are again. Welcome to another episode of the Running Tales podcast on the Everyday Athlete Podcast Network, where we aim to tell the extraordinary stories of everyday runners. My name is Craig Lewis, and on today's show, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Adrian Kelly, the author of a book called The Success Complex. Dr. Kelly is a sports and performance coach whose work sees him delve into what makes the very best athletes succeed and the lessons the rest of us mere mortals, yes, I'm talking about me again, can learn from them. But before our conversation, I wanted to go through a bit of housekeeping, remind our lovely viewers and listeners about how the project we are pursuing at Running Tales works. As I said before, we're part of the Everyday Athlete Podcast Network, with shows taking place live every second Tuesday on the social media platforms of our partner, Run, Try, Bike. So that's where you can find us if you want to listen to us live. And then we're published as a podcast on Thursdays. And remember, when you're searching, wherever you listen to podcasts, search for the Everyday Athlete Podcast Network rather than Running Tales, because you won't find Running Tales. Everyday Athlete Podcast Network. That's what you need. And that's because we're part of a fantastic collective of 9 different podcasts covering everything from athletic achievement to coaching, aid station food with a bit of humor thrown in there, to men's mental health. And most recently, we have a new podcast partner, the wonderful Melanin MVP, which tells the running stories of Black athletes and people of color. So please check all that out. And it's obligatory for me to say this. Please give us a positive rating and review wherever you listen, and tell all your friends about us. So without any further ado, let's bring forward today's guest, Dr. Adrian Kelly, and have a little chat about the Success Complex. Adrian,
hi, Craig.
Running Tales.
Great to be on. Unfortunately, I'm not a doctor. Maybe I will be someday. I'm a master's degree student at the moment, but I'm a solicitor by trade, which I'll tell you all about, of course, as well.
Oh, sorry, Adrian. I'm not quite sure where I've got you.
That's okay. My first cousin's a doctor. Yeah.
We'll give you some more titles.
Exactly. That's okay.
Well, I'm sure there's many doctors who might be listening who'd wonder how to be a success. And this is a massive question to start off with, but and I appreciate it's not necessarily a short answer, but kind of briefly, what is and what makes a success complex, or the success complex?
So, well, thanks, Greg. I suppose in the book, the context of the title really centers on like a complex in the sense of a fear of heights or small spaces. So it's, if I had a complex about heights, I'd be, I wouldn't like to climb ladders or whatever. So what is that invisible force that's stopping you achieving what you define as success? I suppose, and I suppose I'll introduce the book in terms of what motivated me to write it, if that's okay. Ultimately, I'd be an avid reader, and I've read a lot of self-help books and positive psychology books, and I found after a while that it's a bit of a jungle out there in terms of the information that's available, and it can be difficult to know where it fits for you. And one of the objectives in writing the book was trying to develop a framework, which I hope certainly goes beyond the book and will live beyond the book for the reader, as a framework in which to attach new information and where it fits for them. It's a suggestion. And the book is divided into 3 parts. One is the skills you might develop to overcome challenge, whether that challenge is sought out or thrust upon us. I always say trust upon us, and people go, well, maybe I don't want challenge. Maybe I just want to sit at home and leave me alone. Well, unfortunately, challenge is there for everybody. And the second part of the book is, when we apply the skills that we've acquired, can we do it in a sustainable way? In a way that avoids burnout, in a way that avoids making bad decisions, outside our value system, whatever that might be. And the third part, which is probably the most challenging part of the book, was what would I like more of in my life? Like, what's worth aiming for in my life? And when I started writing the book, I didn't have those answers, and that kind of was exciting in one way and terrifying in another, because you have a publication date or certainly some deadlines with a publisher. But I wanted to stay with that unknown, stay with that uncomfortableness, to try and not deflect to easy answers, but trying to ask hard questions, interview as many people as possible from different arenas, and try and come up with real answers that hopefully can make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, one thing I found quite interesting actually was, I mean, you spoke about having read a lot of self-help books, and sometimes in those kind of books, it can be a bit, do this, try harder, work faster, all that kind of stuff. And look, within the book, you do talk about you have to work hard to be successful, but you also talk about, I think, the enjoyment that you have to find in that. It's not all, to give a running thing, David Goggins, run as hard as you possibly can every day and you'll be the best runner ever. It's also try and enjoy this stuff, and I suppose don't sweat the hard stuff too much while you're still moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and the point you're making there is a really good place to start, which is motivation, and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic being money, rewards, trophies, an outcome or an end result. Intrinsic, which tends to be much more long-lasting and deep-rooted, is it really centers around the inherent enjoyment we can find in any activity. Running, for example. I love to run. It clears my head, and and often you come up with some great ideas when you're running. You're in that kind of zone, that hypo-prefrontality, as they call it in performance psychology. So there was a great study done back in the late 1940s by a guy called Harry F. Harlow, and it was with a group of monkeys, and I think I refer to it in the book. And they had one set of monkeys who had these. They had these rewards, these peanuts and whatever else rewards that they got. Then they had a control group who had no rewards whatsoever, and they had a set of tasks to do. And they were like, pull the pin out of the box and try and open it up or whatever else. And they assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that the monkeys that had the rewards would do the best job. But it turned out that actually the monkeys that had no rewards did it quicker. They 100% of them solved the puzzles. And many years later, there was many studies after that to try and dig into that and find out why that was. And ultimately, what they unearthed from a kind of a research point of view is that the monkeys were doing it because they enjoyed doing it, not because of some external reward. And I think, to answer your question, the more we can stay with that inherent value of the activity that we're involved in, typically the better we'll be at it, because we enjoy doing it for doing its sake, if that makes sense. And particularly for employers or mentors that are listening, I think that's important information. It's about get back to what we enjoy doing and try and stay with that. We all need to pay the bills and feed our family, of course, so we need those external rewards at the end of the week. But I think it's folly to build an entire reward system based on waving a carrot in front of somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually thinking about that, what you just mentioned there, in terms of, we've got to live, we've got to exist, we've got to pay the bills, pay the mortgage, do all the stuff that we can get. I don't know if sucked into is the right phrase, but we end up doing that, and that can end up being our lives. But how can we get that balance between paying the mortgage and doing all those things, and having the job that we love and doing the things that we love?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. You have to read the book. No, I'm going to joke. Yeah, I'm going to jump right to the end here a little bit, and it really comes down to defining what success means to us, and it's a very subjective thing. So it's your success is not the same as mine. It's important to kind of spend time and think about what it is you want to get out of life in the first place. And we only have a short number of years on this planet. It's an important exercise to do. Second thing to think about is success, or what we're looking for. It tends not to be permanent. Success tends to be fleeting in nature. And there's been a lot of great kind of research done and textbooks written on this subject. And what I like, what I've read and found hits home, is this concept of not necessarily happiness, but happyorness, which is this Arthur C. Brooks wrote a couple of books on this area. And he talks about the difference between hedonic hits and eudaimonia. So hedonic hits being endorphin-based hits, partying, whatever else gives you your endorphin. It's running, and that's great. But eudaimonia tends to be a much more long-lasting and worthwhile pursuit, and that's Aristotle's definition of happiness, which is underlying well-being and moving towards growth in different spheres of our life: physical, psychological, emotional, and once you're on that road of growth as a person, and in all those wider contexts, you can have a bad day, have a bad week, suffer kind of. You don't necessarily have to be happy in the moment, but you'll know that it's underneath, that it's going somewhere purposeful, that you have a plan. And I talk a lot about that in the book, So that's a roundabout way of answering the question of how do we find happiness in our day-to-day, week to week, and find that balance. Well, it involves, unfortunately, a little bit of legwork on our own part to find out what, back to the monkey example, what do we find inherent value in the first place? How do we get more of that? And also to realize that, it's not a panacea. We won't always be happy, but we can certainly get on a road of happyorness, which is worth aiming for, and I think is quite achievable.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and can definitely be applied to obviously what we talk about a lot more than anything else here, which is which is running in a couple of ways really, which is perhaps if your work life is a bit tougher or whatever, we've got that great freedom that running gives us, that great escape that it gives us, but also I think that we tend to find that people who are really committed to running will know that as you go through a training plan, that every run is not going to be this wonderful transcending, and I know you talk about transcendence a lot, but this wonderful transcending thing where we're flying every time doing our fastest ever PBs. You have some horrible runs along the way, and yet we continue to that goal, whether that's a race or whatever it might be at the end of it. And I think some ways running is kind of perhaps a really good example of what you were talking about there.
Mm. And I do a lot of running myself, and I wouldn't be anywhere near elite level or anything like that, but I run a lot of 5Ks, 10Ks, ran the first half marathon last year. And I think if we apply our conversation to running for a moment, it comes back to, how does it feel to run? I'm a very kind of kinesthetic person in terms of how do things feel, and I like to structure information for myself in that way. But often, if you're having those horrible days, it's probably horrible because you're not meeting some time that you've set for yourself or something. You're running at a too fast of a pace per kilometer or whatever it might be. Maybe it's more about, on those days, getting back to slowing down a little bit and thinking how wonderful it is to be out there running in the first place. Running just heightens the senses. It brings us into the moment. It's kind of a natural mindfulness exercise in many ways. And also to think about the reason you're doing it. And typically it's the feeling you get afterwards. Some people feel exhausted, but if you're a regular runner, I get that endorphin hit. I feel rejuvenated. The next thing that I do, I have kind of that extra little bit of focus because I've done the exercise. I feel good. I know I'll probably sleep a little bit better that night. So if we can get away from, oh my God, I can't believe it, I'm doing a 26-minute 5K when I should be running a 24, is to get away from that perspective and focus more on the joy of running, if that doesn't sound too cheesy.
Oh no! Do you know what, that's kind of exactly the mantra that we try to look to here. I mean, none of us, I'm certainly not anyway, are elite athletes. We don't tend to try and be talking to elite athletes. Sometimes we do because they've got interesting perspectives on the sport as a whole. But mostly we're talking to people who might achieve extraordinary things, but are generally just doing it as a hobby. And so often what we try and come back to, and what we hear from our guests is, I'm doing this, and when I'm doing it at my best is when I'm really enjoying it, and it's my escape, it's fun, it's what I'm enjoying, and then actually suddenly out of nowhere I find that the results are improving as well.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, life is, the pursuit of a goal is about consistency, isn't it? It's about being able to chip away at something in the long term, and not everybody can do that, and not everybody can do it sometimes because they're focused perhaps on the wrong things. You're focused on the goal itself, and I feel like I'm going around in circles there a little bit, but I think if we can identify what really we enjoy about any activity, particularly activities which are a little bit harder and lead to a lot of positive outcomes, I think that's a very worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, and just going back to something else in the book, if I've got this right, and feel free to correct me if I don't, but I think you talk about the one school of thought where you can kind of become not perfect, but very, very good at something if you put in 1,000 hours of work. But actually, what I think you go on to say is that's not true. Just almost, this sounds like counterintuitive, but almost lazily working every day without having the right building blocks in there kind of doesn't work just to do the time. You need to have the right building blocks and the right things in there and the enjoyment to keep it moving forward. And sometimes you can do less hours, but in a more constructive way to achieve more success rather than just continually doing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the topics and one of the conclusions I do get to is what's good enough for you. You don't have to be world class. You don't have to be national class. I mean, it doesn't actually take that long to arrive at a reasonable level of competence at pretty much anything that you want to achieve. There's a great TED talk actually on I think it's called it's called something around 20 hours. You know, like 20 hours of purposeful practice. You would be shocked at how good you can get at anything from, you know, starting to learn to play the guitar to whatever it might be that you always wanted to give it a go. Unfortunately, and we talked about this off air, in the information age, we can log on there and see anybody in the world that's better than, we can always find people that are better than anything we do out there on the internet. It's only a couple of clicks away. And that immediate comparison can be very demotivating. But, you know, in terms of building your unique skill set for a set of reasons, it can be for health, it can be for enjoyment, it can be to pursue some goal, it can be to social reasons, you know, to go running with other people. It's you know, with quite a small degree of effort in many cases, you can achieve a very passable, very acceptable level of proficiency. And I think it's probably maybe worthwhile becoming proficient at a broader range of things rather than trying to become elite at any one thing. And that's just my personal preference. You know, I think it just means it leads to much richer existence and experience to try and upskill yourself in a range of activities that you might enjoy.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about running and we pick up the dreaded injuries and then we don't know what to do for the next 2 months while we're waiting to get better.
Well, this is it. And then if we go to the other extreme and we look at people that I absolutely want to be the best in the country, or, you know, I mean, there's lots of material out there on that as well. I mean, you know, stuff I'm studying at the moment for my master's degree, but certainly, you know, The Making of an Expert, Peak. There's some great books out there, Anders Ericsson, and but there are no shortcuts to that, and it's bloody hard work, but it's achievable. Usually, you can achieve remarkable results once you apply yourself. But there's a word in there that doesn't get used often enough. Certainly with the younger generation, and that's sacrifice. So usually, to get something worthwhile, what are you willing to sacrifice for that? Because usually you have to make space somewhere. Something has to go, whether it's less time watching TV, going to the cinema, seeing friends. And I write in the book extensively about Marty Fish and what he was willing to give up to get what he wanted. And he's a tennis player, former US #1. I have 2 chapters devoted to Marty. Shout out to Marty. And yeah, certainly in part. And you know, he went from 123 in the world very late in his career to number 7. But I detail, you know, what he had to do to get to that standard, including sleeping in an oxygen chamber, going to bed at 7:30 in the evening, living like a strict athlete's diet, training every hour that God sends. And it led to remarkable results, but it also had remarkable costs because he wasn't in a position to sustain that for a variety of reasons. And with the information that's out there today and the training that's out there today, this is only 2012, but it's moved on a lot. And the science of recovery is developing all the time. And I'm a big believer in allowing space to recover and develop. And that's where the true benefit of all that hard work kicks in. But it's about, you know, it's about allowing that space to adapt and allow that training effect to take place. I'm sure many of your listeners will know that phrase.
Yeah, and I mean, I was fascinated by the Marty Fish story. I'd heard of him. I knew that he sort of did a bit better during the later stages of his career, but certainly didn't know the full story and the efforts that he went to. But I suppose the interesting thing with Marty's story was that I suppose what you might call the downside of it was the burnout. And how can athletes or runners avoid that burnout that can, you know, your performance levels can go up and then potentially crash?
Yeah, so absolutely, and I've a chapter devoted to this as well. And I'm shamelessly selling my book here, so sorry, Craig. So one of the interviews I did was with a guy called Dr. Ken Van Summeren, who is who was the chairman or the head of the UK Olympic Committee for 4 years, right up to the 2012 Olympics. He has extensive knowledge in this area. He's a physiologist, and his wife Janine, they're both physiologists, and I did a few interviews with them, and heart rate variability tends to be a really rapidly developing science at the moment, and they have certain technologies. First beat, you wear this heart monitor. People, your listeners will know it from their Whoop or their watch, etc. But that's what's called peripheral technology. These guys are focused on actually what your heart is doing. So you wear monitors on your heart for 3 days and diary your activities, etc., etc. And the purpose of that, and this is what I found incredibly interesting, the purpose of that is to really find out what is an active recovery exercise for you. And and most people think of recovery as lying on the couch watching TV or whatever else. But funny enough, it's not necessarily that at all. You can be in a very good state of active recovery, as I found out. You get this green graph, in your data, doing things that you really enjoy doing. For me, might be doing podcasts or public speaking, believe it or not, or writing, and that's just therapy for me. I love doing that, and everybody's makeup is different, of course. Some people would hate that. Whereas, and that's contributing to an end product for me. That's contributing to a productive end product, but it's also good recovery for me. Whereas there are things that mightn't be recovery for me, stressful things. I love my kids, but you might be in the car with the kids, and baby's having a row, and you look at that, and your graph's all red, and your heart rate variability is not good. So it's about mapping it out over a 24-hour period, seeing what your sleep cycles are like, mapping your chronotype, when you like to get up, when you like to go to bed. And once you get that information, suddenly now you're empowered to try and tailor a quality recovery plan for yourself, depending on the level of exertion, for your training plan or how hard you're working. And I had a burnout experience in my mid-20s when I qualified as a solicitor. I kind of moved firms after I qualified, and I took over from a solicitor that was qualified for 7 years, and she moved away, and I took over all her files. And I didn't know what was happening to me because I was getting these headaches. I thought I had a brain tumor. I ended up getting an MRI and an ECG done, and they said, you know what? Good news, you're all clear, but we think it's stress. I also developed this tremor on my hand. I couldn't believe the physical impact that stress has on your body. And it's really important particularly as we get older to be very conscious of striking that balance. But the good news is that if we want to get ourselves fitter, we want to work harder, we want to deliver results and push ourselves and dig deep, if we put in place a recovery plan, we can actually grow our battery of performance. We can learn to deal with more. We can deal with more stress, deal with more work, provided it's commensurate with a tailored recovery plan, so that you're working hard, you're recovering, and you're working harder, you're recovering for longer. This is what Olympic athletes do. They tailor their energy levels and tailor their efforts in a way that's more and more productive, more and more robust in terms of effort, but will also have that commensurate longer recovery period. I think that's really important information. I don't think it's information that's widely known. That we can. It's unlike your smartphone, where you charge it and whatever, and the battery starts to deplete after a while or whatever, and there's wastage. Your battery, your internal battery as a human, can grow with the right recovery plan. The starting point is to get the right information on how you recover best, and the activities you can tailor to get that effective recovery.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating, and you particularly see this, or I've particularly seen this with some people who are running for the first time. I did it myself. I've spoken to other people who do it. We go out and we think what we've got to do is every time we go for a run, we've got to run as fast as we possibly can. Every training run, maybe run as further than you did the last time. I run 5K, now I've got to run 6K, now I've got to run 7K, now I've got to run 10, and so on. And all you're going to do by doing that is end up injured. But so many people fall into the trap, and it's almost like as people, we don't know that rule, and somehow in our education, where we've been learning all these things about history, geography, and maths and whatever, we've not learned that basic component of you need to rest in order to go out and do the next big thing. So my wife's a running coach, and she'll go, if you do 10 miles one week, 12 the next, then drop down to 8 the week after, or 6 before you go back up again. And it's like a staggered training plan, but we just don't naturally seem to know that.
It's so true. And I mean, the other thing that people miss, and it's easy to miss, is those accompanying activities like skipping or stretches or your glute exercises and building those muscles up doing a proper stretch, doing your warm downs, which are boring and hard to do. And you might just do a day where you're doing your stretches, doing your glute exercise, wherever else, do a little bit of skipping. You don't feel like you've necessarily worked out, but you know what? You've actually done something that's very complementary and important to your overall objective. And it's about having it's about a structured approach. And the whole book is about a structured approach to life, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting. I found it really interesting how it can be applied to so many different aspects of your life. Was that something that you set out to do when you started writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, how the book came about, I did a non-fiction writing course during COVID. People were looking for new ways to entertain themselves during COVID. This is what I did. And I wrote the book proposal, and the publisher says, we'd love to write that or publish that book if you'd write it, and I'd never written a book before. I said, okay, that's interesting. But when we settled on the subject matter, the publisher was like, well, you're biting off a big subject here, you're interrogating the subject of success. And what's meaningful and what will resonate with people and what direction they can go with success. They're massive questions, they really are. But in a way, I needed those big questions to really motivate me to put the legwork in and find something worthwhile. And they said, write it for an intended reader. And I kept coming back to this notion of people at a crossroads. And I've got a number of crossroads in my life and with big decisions to make. And I wrote it intended for, if somebody could pick this up and read it when they do have big decisions to make, maybe this will help people try and make sense of the sort of direction that they're aiming for. Because, and we're going to move on slightly here in subject matter, because I find that people, certainly in the information age, as we spoke about, people don't have careers for life anymore. They're not working in an office for 40 years. You can now run businesses from websites, from apps, etc., etc. You can road test business ideas and very cheaply without a lot of money down. You can have virtual offices. You can have partnerships as opposed to staff. But most importantly, you can have a diversified skill set that you can tailor and expand and enrich in order to take advantage of opportunities as they arise and move quickly. And then when that opportunity goes, you can retract again. And I've had a lot of personal experience of that. I mean, I started my career as a solicitor for many years. But then we had the financial crash in 2007 through 2012, really, that kind of took to get to see some sort of level of recovery. And I kind of decided, well, we've been cut here in terms of, as a criminal solicitor, they just cut all the legal aid, for criminal solicitors by 25% just overnight. So I was on the lookout for other things, and I'd been 6 years, and when you do 6 years in anything, you're kind of on that. It's kind of the same merry-go-round. You're not learning as much as you were learning. So then a guy came into my office one day and he says he wanted to lodge a patent for an idea for a wind turbine, and I ended up forming a company with that guy, and we went off and we raised 20 million euros over a 10-year period and had 30 staff, and we sold products out of China into America and other places and traveled the world doing deals, and it was great. It was a great experience. And then in 2018, I left that business and started consulting for the government in the Trade Ireland, who kind of promote businesses, cross-border business, imports, exports, and also working with a big law firm here in Ireland, doing consultancy and training work for their solicitors. And since then Brexit exploded. So I started a company called Brexit Plan, and I put together a team mostly of partners, not employees, and had the virtual office and called it Brexit Plan. And out of 60 providers on the Trade Ireland website, I think I was the only one with Brexit in their name, because people saw it as a part-time gig. This Brexit stuff isn't going to last that long. But I went all in, and we did a pilot work on Brexit. But then Brexit's gone now, pretty much from an advisory perspective. So, but I didn't have to make anybody redundant. I didn't have to, So it's about having that low overhead, that you can roll out and expand as it's needed to delve into an opportunity, and then contract again as the opportunity disappears. And I think that's probably a good tip in terms of how to tackle business opportunities. But I think careers are becoming more and more like that. It's becoming more diversified and nimble and flexible, and to see the way that the opportunities are rising and falling away. And I think the world is, particularly in the current climate, things are so turbulent. There's lots of opportunity, and it's really about building credibility as a base, building on that experience, and then tailoring your skill set to take advantages of opportunities as they come along.
Yeah, Yeah, I think moving quite quickly is and having the skills, a wide skill set to be able to do that is certainly something that people need these days. Um, how does risk play into that? Maybe going back to you can see I'm massively risk averse. Apparently, all I want to talk about is how I'm going to pay my mortgage off at the end of the day.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
come back to it twice now, but it is a factor for things, and maybe if I apply that to sport and running as well, how do people take that jump to go either I want to start my own business, but I'm not sure it's going to make money, or I want to run 100 miler, but I don't think I could ever do that. I don't know. Maybe they're
yeah.
different things, but they seem perhaps
Well,
similar in some ways.
if we stick with the business example for a moment, I've
Mm,
been running this Dragon's Den program in schools for the last 5 years, and yesterday I was talking in a school about the Dragon's Den project with transition year students, 16, 17-year olds, and I talked about this very subject about risk, and a lot of businesses build apparatus around their business, that overhead, which can be a killer. It can be a rock or an anvil around your neck in business. Whereas if you take the approach now, listen, I'm no business genius, but the point is, with Brexit, for example, I think it's just a good example of something that exploded and then was gone
mm,
as an opportunity. First of all, I set up a virtual office, which was £250 a month. Fine. Somebody answered the phone, and it was great. You had a business address, somebody answered on the phone. But once business grew, I didn't need somebody answering the phone anymore. A message was fine. So that came back to 50 quid a month. So that's not a lot of risk. Website costs, not a lot of risk. A couple of grand, you have a website, and you're up and running. And then the government are paying your fees. So per Brexit plan. So getting paid is always the hard part. But it was money in the bank when you did your reports and did your advisory stuff. So I think you have to. There's a phrase I've read in a lot of business called a pre-mortem as opposed to a post-mortem. So start out and think about what can go wrong, and work from the worst case scenario back and fix all the things if you can.
yeah.
Might not be possible. Fix all the things that are high risk about the opportunity, and then say, can I live with the worst case scenario after that? And I think that's certainly the way I looked at that, and I think that's probably not a bad way setting out of things in terms of managing that risk. If that helps answer your
Yeah,
question.
that's really interesting. And I think there was actually a bit you spoke about that in the book as well, where you were talking about almost getting to the final outcome and then working back
Yeah,
from what's impossible. And I think that was the example of the Thai children who
cave
were caught
divers.
in the cave, and it was like, we can't do this. And then somebody
Yeah,
said, well, hold on, if you could do this, if impossible wasn't a word, how would you do it? And they said, well, we do this, this, and this, and this, but it wouldn't work. And he went, well, actually, it would if you did that, or something. I'm oversimplifying, but yeah,
of course. So in the book, first chapter of the book is called Imagining the Impossible, and it's many of your listeners may have come across this on Disney Plus. There's a great documentary called The Rescue, and it's about these kids that were trapped in the cave in Thailand with their coach, and they were 4 kilometers from the cave entrance underwater. It was a 2.5 hour dive just to get them, and these remarkable potholers, cave divers from the UK. Jonathan Voltaine was one of them. They dived down and found the kids. And after they found them, there was an elation. People were like so happy. Wow, it's great. And it was great. But then it dawned on them, how the hell are we going to get them out? Because the cave was still rising, the floodwaters. It was in the middle of the rainy season. And they knew if they tried to dive them out, that they would struggle with being underwater and going through this narrow cave system. Some of the openings are only 15 inches in diameter. So they said, well, listen, there's nothing we can do. We can't get them out. It's impossible. And the guy, Sergeant Derek Anderson, I think he was a US Marine, he said, well, what's the impossible look like? And it was a great question, and we don't ask that enough. So we do this mental calculation in our head and dismiss so many things in life in terms of what we're capable of doing. We just do go, that would never work. I could never do that. Without actually going, well, hang on, there are multiple reasons why I couldn't do it. What if I could? What would that look like for me? So
yeah,
once you asked the question, they said, oh, well, the only way, and this is impossible, the only way we could get them out is if they were inanimate packages. We could maneuver them, if they were asleep or something like that. And he's like, okay, well, let's just stay with that for a moment. And they flew in a guy from Australia who was an anesthesiologist who was also a cave diving enthusiast, Dr. Richard Harris, who later achieved the Australian of the Year for his efforts in rescuing the kids. And what they came up with was remarkable. They put the kids under anaesthetic. and general anesthetic. And he said there was 1,000 ways you could die under general anesthetic, which being asphyxiated if your chin wasn't in the right position, blah, blah. And plus, it was such a long dive they had to re-administer the anesthetic halfway through on the way out of the cave. So incredible stuff. Never been done before. But guess what? They did it, succeeded, and saved all the kids, including their coach. And I think the lesson there for us all, and then the reason I put it as a first chapter is, the rest of the chapters are always about remarkable things in one way or another, but it's to try and open the mind of the reader to, okay, well, hang on a second. We might not have all the answers here. I don't have all the answers, but certainly I've come across people that have done incredible, remarkable things, and it's about not shutting off those answers or falling at the first hurdle by simply dismissing it.
Yeah.
And conditioning in life comes down to a lot of those dismissals, in terms of we can just dismiss things because because that's what people we surround ourselves with or community we're from, whatever it is. A lot of that conditioning that we don't recognize in ourselves, and this is the sort of stuff that I'm studying at the moment in terms of bias and conditioning, and it can be dangerous. It can just automatically shut us off from a lot of opportunity in life. And I think it's important to take a step back and try and look beyond that. And I talk about this metaphorical bridge of opportunity to an end result. And if we could just get across that bridge and look back, sometimes it's easier to reverse engineer a solution. And I talk about chess and grandmasters and how they visualize a checkmate and work backwards very often. And I think there's a lot of good information there in terms of certainly food for thought, regardless of what station of life you're at.
Yeah, no, I found that whole bit fascinating, and I certainly think it applies to running, and when people are thinking about their aims for running, and whether it's your first 5K when you can't walk around the block, or trying to do that 50, 100 miler that you just think is such a huge number that you can't imagine doing it. I just think saying to yourself that you can, and then planning out how you can do it is so important. And the story that we had recently on here that comes straight into my head is perhaps a bit deeper than that. It's my friend, a good friend of mine, Natalie Crawford, who was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis and basically told that she had 4 or 5 years to live, not before she could run her next 5K or whatever, to live. And she wasn't even a runner at that point. And Natalie just decided, she wasn't going to die, and she was going to do whatever she could. And she kind of used running as her weapon to do that. And she's become one of the first women in the world to run a marathon with cystic fibrosis. And she just sort of saw that bridge of opportunity, to use your phrase. And I think that if you believe and you then put in that effort that you mentioned before, then we can all achieve things that we might not ever think are possible.
That's an incredible story. It really is. And I don't have any personal stories to match. But the story I do have, which will probably resonate with your listeners, is I did a half marathon last summer. And a friend of mine said, I'd done a lot of 5Ks and not much more than that. And a friend of mine a few weeks out said, "Oh, I'm doing this half marathon in Northampton. Would you do it?" I was like, "Well, I figured I can always do it, and you can walk part of it if it really comes to that, or whatever, or just do 6 or 7 minute kilometers and trudge along." But it's a little bit like life, isn't it? I did a 15K the weekend before. Didn't feel too bad. I was like, okay. I spoke to a couple of marathon runners. They were like, don't do a lot this week. Go for a few 1K, 2K runs to kind of fool your body into thinking that you're still training but not doing it too heavy. The morning of the race, the wind, this is August, it was like there was gale force winds, driving rain. We had to be in our pens an hour and a half before the race. Everybody was soaked and freezing. And I had kind of this top on. I didn't take it off for the first 5K. It was so cold. And but when I got to the halfway mark, I was with the momentum of the crowd and kind of the buzz. Just it started at a low point, but it got gradually built, throughout the race. And I remember there was a guy with a 10K T-shirt on him. He's got a 2-hour T-shirt on him. You've got these runners, the pacers. Yeah. And I was like, if I can just keep him in sight, And it's like the law of small wins. It's like, okay, I've made it to 10K. I feel okay, actually. You know what I'm going to do? I just need to get out ahead of this guy with the 2-hour marker on him. Because it was packed behind him. Everybody was running behind this guy to try and stay with him. If I can get up, I just put a space in front of him. And once I got ahead of him after 10K, I just started overtaking other runners, And I finished at 1 hour and 57. I was delighted with that. My last kilometer was the fastest kilometer. And you know, I just thought that's something that I never thought I was able to do. I certainly with not a lot of training, but it's not about me. It's more the process of the approach to the race. As in, I didn't put the pressure on myself to go, I got to run, sub 2 hours here, or else whatever. I didn't think about that at all. I just thought about it in increments. How do we feel? And it's back to what we talked about at the very beginning was, to stay with that. Okay, feel good. How do I feel good? That kind of self-talk, and get the stages and get that momentum behind you and start to get small wins. And life is absolutely like that. Life is all about small wins, to build big wins.
Yeah, I mean, I play a lot of cricket, and apologies to our American listeners who are now going to have no idea what I'm talking about for the next 2 minutes. But one thing we say about if you're building an innings in cricket is to try. You might need 250 runs to win. Don't think about the 250. Think about 10. Everyone can score 10. That's easy. Then think about the next 10, then the next 10, then the next 10. And before you know it, you might have 200. And then you only need 5 more of those 10s. And you're, oh, wow, you've won the game. And I think that applies to running when don't think about 13.1 miles, think about 1 and then 2 and then 3. I actually tend to count up to sort of 6.5, 7, and then count down when I'm doing a half. And I think those incremental forms of progression can work really well in tricking the mind and getting you to a goal in the end.
Absolutely, and we spoke earlier about consistency, and one of the chapters in the book was is about luck in terms of increasing your luck, which sounds a bit like provocative. How can you luck is a kind of luck's luck? Well, I talk about that in the context of Napoleon's approach to warfare, and also an example I came across, a local example here in Ireland, that a school principal told me when she was 9 or 10 years old. She saw this bicycle in the window of a shop, and you probably read that chapter in the book, in Dunmurry in Belfast. And it just seemed like an impossible dream to get this bicycle. It was this chopper ribbons on it in a basket, and she really wanted it. And her family were poor. They didn't have enough money to put in the meter to keep the power on at the house, never mind buy a bicycle. But she discovered that there was a draw for this bicycle. And how to enter the draw was you had to shop at crazy prices and then fill out this mantra: shop at crazy prices, because. And most shoppers, they shopped, and the packing area was in a separate area, so they pushed their trolley over, and they looked at this form, and you had to think of this slogan. They're like, whatever, threw it there and left. And she discovered that they were leaving all these behind them. So she, at this young age, took the opportunity to start filling these out, and she filled up to 20 of them a day. She had to think of a different slogan each time, and she also had to time it right so that people would leave them there. They wouldn't be collected by the shopkeepers and put them back in the pile, So there was actually a lot you can learn from that example. First of all, it was observation skills to see it. Secondly, it was the neck to do it. Thirdly, it was the consistency to keep showing up each day, which she did for 6 weeks, and had to walk 2 miles with her sister, who was 2 years younger, through Belfast, which was a dangerous place back in the early 1980s and very, very kind of depressed sort of area. But guess what? She won the bloody bicycle after 6 weeks, which was, I just thought, was such a great story. And we can all learn so much from it, because what were the chances? This was a busy, hundreds of shoppers per week, blah, blah, blah. And, but she won it. And she won it because she showed up. She increased her odds every day of winning that bicycle. But she may not have, but she didn't give up on it. And I think, that little girl is an inspiring story for when we feel like giving up on things that we're trying to do, And she built a momentum to keep going. And the other story in that particular chapter is about Napoleon, of course, that you've probably read, which is how he used the fog in one particular battle. And it was a battle in the modern day Czech Republic in the Pratzen Heights. And he had withdrawn from this high ground position a couple of days earlier. And the enemy thought, well, we have the guy in the run now, this is great. But he'd withdrawn for a strategic reason. He knew in the low-lying area in early December that fog was likely to occur. Now, it may not have, but as it happened, it did. And when it did, he was ready to mobilize his troops through the fog in a way that would surprise the enemy and ultimately win the battle, and he does. And I just thought that was a great example of playing the odds, positioning herself for a success. In his case, having his army well drilled and ready to pounce. Many people wouldn't have been able to do that, and he did. And there's so many ways we can position ourselves for success. And there's a phrase that I use in the book, that I think it's a quote at the start of one of the chapters, that opportunity does not waste time with the unprepared.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's definitely a motto worth living by.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, it's that's a lesson that kind of applies to everything we do. And again, you come back to talking about stretching. We don't stretch before a race. We might pull a hamstring or something like that. And it's so easy to cut those corners in life and in sport that we're going to be okay. And that just kind of brings me back, I guess, to what you were saying earlier as well about all this stuff on social media that kind of either suggests it's dead easy to be the influencer who's done something amazing, when either they've probably spent a load of time doing it but aren't showing you that in their 30-second Instagram clip, or what they presented isn't actually the truth.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't too many shortcuts in life. But anything that's worth doing. I mean, I always think it's who's not willing to do this. I mean, you can certainly differentiate yourself in life by doing things that people aren't willing to do, putting in that extra hard work, those hard miles, getting up earlier. And like Mike Tyson, for example, used to say, the reason I get up and run at 5 a.m. is I know that my opponent isn't doing this. And it's about how do we differentiate ourselves in our effort. And that's very important, I think, psychologically as well. And I've always tried to work super hard at stuff. Maybe there's an insecurity there for me in terms of just trying to. I don't think I'm good enough about things sometimes, and I got to work harder than everybody else. But then you end up being just as good as or better at some things than other people, simply because you show up more than other people show up. Simply like the example we talked about, the little girl, she showed up every day, and every time she put that, that logo or that slogan or that application in the draw, it was a vote for herself in terms of how she showed up for herself. And James Clear, I'm sure you've read some James Clear books. The Atomic Habits. He talks about, well, if I got down on the ground and did 10 push-ups right now, is that going to make much difference? He said, well, it's a vote for the type of person that I want to be. And I think that's a very interesting way to look at things. What do we do today to vote for the type of person that we want to be?
Yeah, well, I suppose to show it from the other side of things, and I know this is a sort of old expression, but it's the it's the overnight success who's been doing something for 20 years. And you only see the overnight success, don't you?
That's right.
We need to work really hard to get to that point if we want to get there. Yeah,
totally. We tend to celebrate, always the outcome, but what we don't see, and even we don't want to hear about, is the hard work that went into it sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to ask you quickly, because we've spoken to 48 minutes about some really interesting stuff, but I should probably talk to you about your own running a little bit as well. Have you always been into running, or was it something you came to later on in life?
Yeah, well, I've always tried to do a little bit. The park run is a great initiative globally, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. But usually I didn't do much more than the park run, and you only run once a week, you're not really going to improve. In fact, you'd probably disimprove. So I tried to, certainly over the last year, I've tried to put a bigger effort in, and I suppose that's been commensurate with with more stress and stuff than of writing the book or doing the masters. The harder I work, the more, and I'm sure people find this, then the more you kind of need a pressure release valve. And I just find there's nothing better to clear your head than going for a good run. And sometimes I look forward to it. It's really sad, I know, but is the interval training. They're really tough, but you can get it over and you feel like you've really done a hard session. It doesn't take that long. And I just find running, and again, this is a personal preference, but in terms of time invested versus return, I think there's no greater time invested in terms of return for mental health, for endorphins, and ultimately, I think for actual physical fitness improvement.
And I think one of the interesting things about it, you kind of touched on it there, is that there's so many sort of different forms and ways to go out and running and to train. You can do your interval sprint, or you might fancy your long slow run because you're going through the through the woods and the countryside, and you're enjoying that, and you want to be away from everything and in your thoughts for a little bit longer. But it all kind of works, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah, that zone, kind of zone 2, zone 3 running is also, it's a total different mood. It's a different objective. It's when you start getting over an hour into a run, you're in a total different state mentally as well, aren't you? You're kind of in this whole different zone now that you wouldn't get to in a 5K. Because right, 5K just seems so rushed. And quite often, if you don't get away in the first kilometer and do that hard first kilometer, I find you're never anywhere near where you want to be for a time, that you're aiming for. That's just personally, I find that.
No, Adrian, I'm with you, and I've spoken to so many people who will tell you, and this includes people who run like these 100-milers and whatever, and they'll turn around and they'll say the hardest races are blooming 5K. It's flipping hard. You just got to run as fast as you possibly can from the start, but it's long enough that you have to have some sort of level of endurance as well. And if you're going to go for a decent time, whatever that is for you, you're going to end up a mess on the floor at the end of it. So it's a horrible distance.
Well, it's usually all over in under half an hour, so it's there's always that.
Yeah.
So we started off the conversation about this, and it might be a good place to wrap it up, which is the end of the book, which is about the objectives and what we'd like more of in our lives, And this was a very interesting part of the book, and probably the most difficult to write. And I picked 3 things in the end. One was control. How can we develop more control in our lives? Because perceived control of our lives is a very important factor for well-being in terms of our mental and physical health. If we're out of control and on other people's diaries and, on the phone all the time and on that treadmill, it can be very, very bad and detrimental to our health, and sometimes in an unseen way. And I write in the book about the culture in China, which is the 996 culture, which is 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, working for big corporates out there, and how they monitor every move you make in these big warehouses, and you have to scan a barcode and walk quickly to the next barcode and scan it again, and you can't run. You're on a disciplinary, and what that results in. These are extreme examples, of course. There's a thing called Bafu Singaye, which is a Chinese phrase, means revenge bedtime procrastination. So those people go home at 10 p.m., they have something to eat. Suddenly, this is their only personal time all day. And they stay up until the early hours of the morning watching Netflix and, I don't know, playing Fortnite, whatever. And don't get enough sleep. And then it ends up impacting on their whole life cycle because, if you don't get enough sleep, you're back in that treadmill the next day. And, Western culture is getting a bit like that as well. And it's that always-on culture of emails and texts and WhatsApp groups we have to be careful about those because they eat into our autonomy, in terms of we're responding now, we're reacting to somebody else's message, somebody else's email, somebody else's agenda, somebody else's diary. And it's how and why to carve out more space for yourself. And that's not a money thing generally. Sometimes it's just the ability to say no, or just say, what, I'm reorganizing that meeting. Or it's a very empowering thing to take charge of your diary and we spoke off air, but just getting away from that treadmill any way you can at times and getting that recovery. We spoke about recovery. The second thing is purpose. And we also started off talking about defining our own success. And I interviewed a guy who's a remarkable character, and maybe you have him on a podcast at some point, a guy called Marcus McGee, who's a very talented musician, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. It was stage 1, then it went to stage 4 very quickly. And suddenly, a bit like, was it Natalie you mentioned earlier, this guy only had a couple of years left to live in terms of prognosis. And, I spent time with Marcus, I interviewed him, I tried to be very gentle and respectful, but I thought it was very interesting in terms of the view of life that he undertook, which was it crystallized. He was crystal clear about what he wanted to do. Yep. And he had certain objectives he wanted to meet, including publishing an album, which he did. And he did all of these things quite quickly. And, it's just a shame that, he needed that catalyst, and we shouldn't need a catalyst in our lives of serious illness to develop our priorities and try and go out and do them. And I just think he's such a wonderful inspiration. Thank God he's still alive and healthy, today, and he's very much stable, thankfully. And he's produced a wonderful album, which, I'm going to give him a shameless plug. There's Marcus McGee and the Hollow Men, and the album is Rising from the Hollow. So it's a great it's a great album. And then the final part of the book is about ultimately what will give us fulfillment in life. And again, this is a subjective. What gives fulfillment to one person might give to another person. But the father of behavioral psychology and positive psychology, I should say, is Abraham Maslow. And he has this pyramid, which anybody who does a business course will come across and see. And the top of the pyramid, you had other esteem needs and food and shelter, etc. At the lower end of the pyramid, but at the top was self-actualization, being all we can be as people. And towards the end of his life, he published that in the 1940s. He said, actually, I might have got it wrong.
Yeah.
Probably what's most important from a fulfillment point of view is a success or fulfillment that means we win together. It's what we can do for other people. And I think that's such an important point. And I focus in the book on Robert McNamara, a huge historical figure in American culture and American political life. He was JFK's Secretary of Defense. He was the president of the World Bank, president of Ford Motor Company after Henry Ford himself. And towards the end of his life, he lived till 93. He made this fabulous documentary called The Fog of War. And he was around 86, 87 when he made that. And the Fog of War shows him meeting his counterpart in the Vietnam War, who was the Vietnamese Secretary of Defense at the time. And he met him in 1995. And he said, you know what I concluded from that meeting? If we'd only taken the time to understand more about our perceived enemy, the war could have been avoided. We don't take enough time. We talk about transcendence. Transcendence not necessarily in the religious sense, but in the sense that to take our time to look across the fence, and walk in our neighbour's shoes and see the opposing arguments. And we live on such a small planet. We're not going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, Donald Trump and Musk are talking about a colony on Mars. I think we're a little bit away from that.
Mars or Greenland, I'm not sure at the moment.
If it's a zero-sum game, I don't think that's true success. If I win and you lose, that's not success. We need to start learning to win together on this small planet, and we only have to look at the news cycle and Gaza and the rhetoric that's coming out and the kind of hostility in politics, both here and in America and other places, and it's more and more hostile, more and more zero-sum. And I think ultimately, as a human race, as we evolve, we need to learn more and more to win together and define our personal success in terms of how we can help others win and include others in our goal to really, arrive at a truly fulfilling outcome.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. A brilliant place to end as well. I could actually talk about this for another hour or two with you, Adrian. But just quickly before we round up, could you tell people all about the book, where they can get it, what's it called, etc., so they can go out and get it?
Absolutely. So if you Google The Success Complex by Adrian Kelly, you'll get probably 17 or 18 different book outlets online that are carrying it. Amazon carries it, and then you've Goodreads, WH Smith, Waterstones, all those quality bookstores. It's also the audiobook version is coming out next Tuesday, the 28th of January, and it's available on Audible and also on Apple Books. So it's highly available. And then the podcast series, the accompanying podcast series, which is the interview with Marcus and other people, there's only 3 episodes, one for each part of the book, is on Spotify. And it's also called The Success Complex.
Fantastic. Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today on Running Tales. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think there's so many things that people can pick up to help them in life and in running if running is their thing. So I really appreciate your time. Folks out there, if you enjoyed our conversation today, go and buy the book, Adrian Kelly, not Dr. Adrian Kelly. It's The Success Complex. Go and grab that, and also please give us a positive rating or review wherever you listen to Running Tales on the Everyday Athlete Podcast Network. We will be back in 2 weeks' time with another Running Tales podcast, another extraordinary story of everyday runners, where we'll have lots of hints and tips so you can become a better runner and learn a bit more. Please check out Running Tales on Substack as well. That's where you can find some written versions of these conversations. runningtales.substack.com. And yeah, I'll catch you all again soon. So thank you very much, everyone, and thanks again, Adrian.
My pleasure. Thank you, Craig.